Hello everyone, my name is SurrealBeliefs and welcome to Surreal Lore. Today we'll be talking about Bretonnia. I'll go over their origins, heroes, culture, land, and all of that in one video. There will be a timestamp down below that will lead to each section. That way, if you want to know about a certain part of their culture, of their people, or things like that, it'll be very convenient for you to get there. We'll begin with Chapter 1, The Origins of Bretonnia. The Bretonnian calendar begins from the foundation of their kingdom by Gilles le Breton in the year 979 of the imperial calendar. I'll go by the imperial calendar's dates for simplicity's sake. That way in the future, if I bring up two dates, you know what they refer to. Bretonnia's origins began 3,500 years ago when they were just a nomadic tribe called the Bretonnian. They would later cross the Great Mountains and settle in the lands that are now known as Bretonnia. Here you had an era of constant conflict with the greenskins, beastmen, and other evil creatures who infested their future kingdom. They even attempted to enter the Forest of Arden, and that was met with a lot of tragic ends, for the invaders were driven mad by Fey magic. Keep in mind, you don't go into the Forest of Arden and live to tell about it. Later, you would have Sigmar Heldenhammer, who would unite the tribes of the future empire. He called the Bretonnia to join his cause. The 20 leaders of the Bretonnia refused, not wanting to bend knee to a foreigner. Sigmar Heldenhammer would beat back the greenskins and forge the empire. The Bretonnia would remain disorganized for a period of 1,000 or so years. Initially, there were several tribes, but over time they would either amalgamate and form larger tribes, or they were completely wiped out by the greenskins, beastmen, and again, all those other evil creatures that were settling around there. 208 years before the founding of their kingdom, the lands of the Bretonnia were divided into 16 areas, each controlled by a duke and his tribe. Two of these areas would later be absorbed into other regions at a later date, but the remainder would set the foundation for the later duchies of Bretonnia. One of the provinces that fell during this time period was Coelho. 48 years before the founding, Warlord Gagabad would lead a horde of greenskins that overran Coelho. Their horsemen charged out of one last attempt to break the greenskins, but unfortunately they were outnumbered and overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of orcs and goblins. Canels and Brion, two other duchies, would ride out and destroy the remaining orcs, and instead of fighting over the lands of their brethren, the two dukes agreed to duel, with the victor taking the spoils. The Lord of Brion lost and the lands of Canels expanded. After the destruction of Coelho, that would mark the beginning of the wars that would culminate in the final unification of the Kingdom of Bretonnia. 46 years before the founding, or in 932 of the imperial calendar, Baldwin, the young Duke of Brion, would lead his armies to victory, defeating Gragabad once and for all and killing him in single combat. During that battle, Gragabad's great axe would become lodged into the Duke of Brion's shield, and for the entirety of that fight, he would fight on with that axe in place, and after he killed Gragabad in single combat, that symbol, the symbol of the shield with the axe in place, would become the symbol of Brion from that time onwards to commemorate and remember that great event. But, as things always do often get worse in Warhammer, it did here as well. Over in 30 years before the founding, or in 948, the northern lands were completely overrun by greenskins, beastmen, and other evil creatures. You even had Norse raiders coming from the Sea of Claws coming down to raid here. The northern tribes were driven back into their castles, their strongholds, or whatever they had. They had to only defend their castles while you had evil creatures frolicking all over their fields, unfortunately. Then later, you had Gilles Baston, heir of the Duke, who would kill a great rim called Smiargus deep in the forest of Cholon. And that would be 26 years before the founding. Though he was wounded, he brought the beast's severed head back to Castle Baston, where it still hangs above Gilles Gate, named in his honor. Gilles took to wearing the dragon's hide as a cloak, and he would even adopt the symbol of that rim as his personal heraldry. Now we're getting closer to the unification wars that would finally form Bretonnia. 4 years before the founding, orcs would pour forth from the mountains and forests in numbers that had never been seen before in Bretonnia. The Bretonnia were unable to help each other out. Keep in mind, they were isolated. They were forced back into their castles, and you would have another dukedom that would be completely destroyed. The dukedom of Glen Boreal, completely destroyed. Later, you would have the dukedom of Carcassonne that would take their lands and expand their own duchy. In the following years, you would have the Duke of Baston, who would be killed repelling the attack on his lands, and was succeeded by Gilles le Breton, who would later be known as the Unifier. And now we'll get to the history. The Unification Wars. Gilles le Breton gathered his armies and led them to Bordelot with the hopes of stopping the greenskin hordes from combining. If they were to combine, their numbers would be so great that every Bretonnian would be killed and driven to the sea. Theorulf of Lyonesse, Gilles' childhood friend, would join him, and you would also have Lord Landuin of Mousillon. Musion wasn't always a terrible place filled with calamity and evil magic. Here you had a great lord who was known as one of the finest knights in the history of Bretonnia. They joined Gilles le Breton not just out of friendship, but because their own lands were being pressured too. Should those orcs combine, they would all die. And here they had hoped to maybe somehow staunch that tide of orcs by winning early on. One night when their armies would be camped by the forests of Cholon, the lords of the Bretonnia met by the side of a small lake. Suddenly, a beautiful maiden, as they were planning their battle, would appear from the water with a golden cup in hand. The maiden would speak to Gilles le Breton and name him as the first king of Bretonnia, having him drink from her cup. His two companions would later drink from that cup, much like Gilles, and they would glow with a similar bright light, much like Gilles le Breton. Here you had the first three Grell Knights, and they would ride forward from the forest and lead their armies into the first great battle. There would be a total of 12 great battles that would form the Unification War, that would eventually form Bretonnia, and we'll go into great detail about each one. If you know about these wars, you know about the foundation of Bretonnia, and you'll have a lot of knowledge about why they are the way that they are. Now to get into the meat of the 12 great battles. These were massive conflicts fought over 2 years and is the basis of the feudal identity of Bretonnia. The first great battle we touched up on a little bit, or the preface of that battle. After Gilles le Breton and his companions became the first Grell Knights, they continued to Bordelot to relieve them of the great horde of greenskins that were currently besieging that castle. There might be a little bit of embellishment because it's almost like a mythological tale. It did happen, but naturally when you have so many epic poems written about a time period, there might be a little bit more to it. Grell Knights are very powerful, don't get me wrong. It said that the three Grell companions did as much slaughter as the remainder of their army combined. The greenskins were driven right to the water. Then you would have Lord Marcus of Bordelot and Lord Fredimund of Aquitaine who would join Gilles le Breton with their armies. After they ate a great victory feast, with all their mead, ale, and all of their meat, mutton maybe, the Lady of the Lake appeared in a private chamber where the lords were gathered together. That's when Marcus and Fredimund both drank from the Grell, and they were turned into 2 more Grell Knights. Marcus would even go so far as to turn that chamber into the first Grell Chapel, a site that is still considered rather holy today. Now we can move on to the second great battle. As the companions rode south to the relief of Brionne, they found their way blocked by the army of the bloated orc warlord Brogtar. Lord Fredimund summoned a great flock of falcons, which struck the flying beasts of the orcs from the sky, and the companions fought their way to the heart of the army, where Landuin struck the warlord down. Which now leads us to battle number 3. The companions would come to Brionne to find the castle besieged, wrapped around with countless greenskins. The knights drove through the besiegers from behind, scattering them like chaff to the wind. Lord Baldwin of Brionne sallied forth with his knights, and they met Gilles le Breton in the middle of the orc armies. Imagine that, on 2 opposing sides, you have knights meeting together in the middle after a very savage affair. They would clasp their forearms together like brothers would. The Lady of the Lake would then appear too, and Baldwin would drink from the Grell as orcs were screaming and dying around them. What a angelic scene to portray. You have a nice moment between the maiden and 2 knights, and then bam, dying orcs all over. Although the knights were outnumbered 300 to 1, the orcs could not stand and were driven from the field, and that will conclude battle number 3. All this time they were being led by the visions of the Lady. Here you had battle number 4 that was about to happen. They would cross the river Brienne and would ride east to Carcassonne towards Canals. As they rode, you had Lord Lambard of Carcassonne who would rally to their banner, but he was not yet a Grell companion. Nevertheless, he would ride on with them. And when they entered Canals, they saw at the borders of the forest of Lauren were aflame, assaulted by the orcs. Some of the knights were afraid to venture there. Keep in mind, the Fae lived here. That would be the Wood Elves that we would talk about at a later point. But Gilles would urge them on, telling them that, well, if we're helping them out right now, they're going to look kindly upon us because, again, they're on fire. And I don't mean their mixtape. Gilles le Breton would be proven true to his word. While they were fighting in the battle against the greenskin horde, you had the Fae fleeing in and out of the shadows, appearing to shoot arrows into the orc hordes, killing thousands of orcs before they would vanish, and even the trees would rise up and help them in the fight. Then you had Radamund the Pure, Lord of Canals, who was right here fighting. After the battle was won, the maiden would grant them all a peaceful slumber. And when they woke up, they were no longer fatigued and they were no longer wounded. They were able to go on. And they would find Radamund and Lambert glowing much like the other Grell Knights, and they had apparently met with the maiden and were turned into Grell Knights too. And now we can move on to another great battle. Now their journey would take them to Paravon, up to the north. The companions would find the beautiful city in ruins. You would have giants raining boulders upon it. Then you would have Lord Agilgar Paravan mounted upon Glorfiniel, his faithful Pegasus, who would fight them in disguise. While goblins of the severed hand laid waste to the city streets, the charge of Jill's army killed every goblin in that city, leaving the city clean and clear. I'm sure after a long period of having to burn orc and goblin bodies, it was clean and clear, but for this time period, they were able to sweep in and wipe them all out to cleanse that city of that orc filth. After, they were joined by Agilgar, and they would ride north to Montfort, where they found that fortress besieged too. Lord Martrud's army fought heroically, but they were greatly outnumbered, much like in every battle. With a war cry that shook the very mountains, Gilles Le Breton led his forces in a charge, but was struck down by a cowardly bolt through the chest launched by one of the goblins' dishonorable machines. His companions rallied about him and fought their way through to Montfort, where they were welcomed by Martrud. Gilles laid in a fever dream, and he was dying, and the companions feared for his life, taking turns to watch over him. At length, the privilege was granted to the lords of Agilgar and Martrud, the news of their number. While they watched, a fair maiden appeared in the room and bathed Jill's forehead with liquid taken from a grell she bore. She then bade the attendant lords drink from the cup, and thus they became true Grell knights as well. When the lords returned their gaze to Gilles Le Breton, his eyes were open, his breathing normal, and with a great roar he pulled the bolt from his own chest, sprang to his feet, and led his army back onto the field of battle without a pause. As soon as he passed the gates, he was assailed by 3 wyverns, which he slew before taking another step, one dying with a fell bolt lodged in its eye. Taking heart from their leader, the besieged struck out once more, but such was the number of their foes that it still took a week to lift the siege and drive the goblins back into the mountains. You can imagine their sheer numbers, right? An entire week of constant fighting to finally eliminate them. We've reached battle number 7. Jill was not content that the orcs were fleeing away. He would gather his army and they would go to the mountains, and here they would keep on hunting down the orcs. They were illuminated by the Grell Knights who were shining with that bright light, as you might remember. And the armies fought their way to the halls of the Goblin Kings, killing them in their own halls. The unity of the Goblin tribes were broken for good, and after that they fought back to the surface from the mountains and emerged covered in the black blood of their enemies. A horrific sight. Currently, they had 10 Bretonnian lords who would follow his banner. Gilles Le Breton would turn to the west to fight the Greenskins, now attacking Gisero. Joining forces with Baron, the lord of that land, Gilles faced a horde containing many of the orcs' finest shamans who turned their found magic against the Bretonnians. It was to no avail as the power of the lady protected her knights, and the companions drove the enemy from the field with great slaughter. Now we can move on to battle number 9. We're about to reach that great conclusion for the unification. From Gisero, they would go west into the lands of Mousillon. Once, Mousillon was a great land, a fair one, but it became wasted during this conflict. You had hordes of greenskins who would just travel here, destroying his land. Unfortunately, Landuin would have to see his people driven into the ground. At the city of Mousillon, his army was met by Fulgar of Artois, who brought news of an approaching horde of beastmen and the walking dead. The defense of Mousillon was divided between the companions, and all fought with surpassing valor. Gilles Le Breton himself hewed the head from a drake beast, whilst Agilgar, mounted on Glorfiniel, took the battle to the bat-winged beast that filled the sky. Thereolf wrestled with and defeated a 2-headed giant. The battle ended when Landuin himself struck down the sorcerer who had raised the dead, and half the opposing army fell to the earth. The beastmen fled towards the forest, pursued by the companions. Baron and Fulgar returned, shining and telling of a meeting with a maiden with a grell just inside the forest borders. And now we're on battle number 10. From Mousillon, they would ride north to the forest of Arden, where no foul creatures dare lay claim. They went to the elf-built port of Languille. The great city was besieged by the Norse tribes from way up north, attacking from both land and sea. Lord Colduin of Languille cut a path right through them, joining forces with the companions, but the battle still raged on. There was no sight of victory for them at this point. You had Lord Marcus of Bordelot, who challenged the leader of the Northmen, Svingard of Skadelings, to single combat, with the condition that the loser's forces would be forced to withdraw. Too proud to refuse, the giant warrior met Lord Marcus atop the great lighthouse, and they fought in view of all of Bretonnia. Throughout the night, the elements seemed to aid Svingard's twin hammers, but as dawn broke, Lord Marcus found renewed strength and drove the Northmen back. With a final blow, Marcus cut the giant in two, and his body fell to the rocks below. And when he died, the Norsemen went to their ships and they fled quickly. They got the hell out of there. After a single night's rest, they would go to the east to Couronne. Here you had Lord Carleond, who would join their army together with his own. Together, they fought an orc horde at the river Sanez and defeated them, the waters of the river turning black with blood. Turning from the light surrounding the Grell companions, the greenskins were cut down in such numbers that the earth was turned to mire by their blood. And finally, we have a conclusive large battle. Battle number 12. The companions with their armies would rally at Couronne, where news of a great host of beastmen, trolls, and other creatures of chaos pouring forth from the forest of Ardent reached them. Upon getting ready to meet that threat, they heard about hordes of greenskins also rising up from the Pale Sisters, and as that army massed before the walls of Couronne, foul rats that walked as men erupted from within the city, stalking the streets and hemming the Bretonnia on all sides. The lords would have to take counsel before that fight, and then the Lady of the Lake would join them. She had Lords Carduin and Carleon drink from the Grail, and at last the Grail companions reached their full number of 14. Then she blessed the army and bade them fight in her name. Emboldened, the knights took the field, sure that none could ultimately stand against them. The battle raged for week upon week as foul creatures continued to pour from their lairs like a storm tide and break upon the armies of the Bretonnia as against a cliff. When at last the sounds of battle fell silent, the plains of Couronne were covered with the bodies of the slain, to the height of a horse's shoulder even. When the bodies of the enemy were burned, the smoke from the pyres darkened the day, whilst the flames brightened the night, so that for months no one could tell the difference between the two. Thus were the Bretonnia united, and the enemy driven from the lands. In presence of the whole army, the Lady of the Lake crowned Gilles le Breton as the first king of Bretonnia, and the acclamation shook the very mountains. Gilles le Breton would lead his people for 17 years. In year 17, he was struck down by a bolt hurled against him again as he fought a orc warlord of the Great Mountains near the edge of the forest of Lordan. When he died, he had a vision and told his companions to bear him to the shores of a nearby lake. There, a boat decked out for a funeral awaited him, and his knights placed their king on the bier and watched as the boat, apparently without crew, carried him into the mist and out of this world. It is believed that his last words were a promise. In the time of Bretonnia's greatest need, when it seems that all hope is gone, I shall return to aid you. The death of Gilles le Breton left the country in need of a new king, but without any rules for choosing one. Some did favor the only son of Gilles le Breton, who was called Louis. He was born under mysterious circumstances, and there was a rumor that he might even be the child of the maiden herself. But others also thought that Landuin, one of the Grail companions, should take the crown. Then you also had Marcus and Therwolf, who were also kind of prompted as candidates for that role. The Great Council would meet up, and they agreed that only the one who had drunk from the Grail could become king of Bretonnia, which pretty much seemed to dash the hopes of Louis. Instead, he would rise up and he would declare that he would try to find the Grail and drink from it to prove his right to be the king. He would ask the lords of Landuin, Therwolf, and Marcus to serve as regents until he returned, and when they agreed, the council was at an end. He was very bold, and he was called Louis the Rash from that point on. In year 23, Louis would return to the court riding a purebred charger and shining with light. None could deny he had drunk from the Grail, and he was welcome as king. Louis would draw up the decrees of chivalry, formalizing the code by which all the companions had lived, and his own quest was a pattern for the questing knights of the future. Those who would complete that quest would become Grail Knights, the elite nobility of Bretonnia. Now we're going to talk about the Errantry Wars, which is another important defining time period of Bretonnian history. The Errantry Wars are named because you had young Bretonnian knights who would spend a period of their time as a knight errant. They would seek out dangers in the world to prove themselves in combat. Only those who would actually succeed in that goal could become Knights of the Realm. The King of Bretonnia can channel that custom by declaring an Errantry War, a grand campaign that qualifies all knightly participants for the higher status, which is a great time period for young people to prove themselves in war. The first of such wars was declared in 471 or 1449 of the imperial calendar against the Arabians who had invaded Estalia. The invaders were driven back, and a second army, which heard of the victory en route, turned aside to clear greenskins from the lands that became the border princes. Another Errantry War would be declared in 1223 or 2201 of the imperial calendar, and that had the aim of getting rid of every orc from Bretonnia. That was pretty much an impossible goal though. Orcs are everywhere and they're very hard to uproot. But they were able to drive out many of the orcs, and many dukedoms were able to expand their boundaries into the mountains where previously they were unable to do so. And now we're going to talk about King Charlemagne, who would declare another Errantry War in 1442, or 2420 of the imperial calendar. His goal was a little bit more crazy, mad even. He had a goal of getting rid of every greenskin in the world, and many knights would leave on that war that unfortunately, Bretonnia was also vulnerable to orc raids. In 1510 or 2488, a mighty host of knights would vanish into the Death Pass, said to have been slain by the Black Orc warlord Morglum Necksnapper. The king then declared the Errantry Wars at an end. Now we're going to head back to the fall of Mousillon. In the time of Landuin, Mousillon was a great land, and Landuin was a fantastic knight, by far the most well-known of the companions. But unfortunately, those who would follow him were not cut of the same cloth, and Mousillon would gain a reputation as a cursed land plagued by the walking dead. In 835 or 1813 of the imperial calendar, you had what was called the Red Pox that would ravage Bretonnia, and Skaven laid siege to Brion and Kenels. Duke Merevich of Mousillon and his knights were unaffected by the plague and rode forth to relieve the sieges and cast the Skaven back into their lairs. Duke Merevich would host a celebration in the halls of Mousillon, but the other lords were disgusted by him. They saw spitted and impaled criminals displayed within the hall itself, leading Merevich to claim his hospitality was being dishonored. The king spoke out against the duke's cruelty, and the duke in turn accused the king of trying to unseat him, challenging him to single combat. The king took him on, and Merevich defeated him, tearing out his throat with his bare hands and then drinking the king's blood from a goblet. Horrified, the other lords raised their armies, and most of the lands of Mousillon were annexed by Lyonesse. In 1319, or 2297 of the imperial calendar, you had Duke Maldred of Mousillon, claimed to have taken the Lady of the Lake as his wife. He and his consort appeared with a shining cup, which they said was the Grail, and many knights who felt unfairly treated flocked to their banner. As the Duke rode to Gisero to claim the crown, he was met by the army of the king. Maldred held aloft the Grail, asking who dared to stand against its bearer. Once the opposing army stood silent, the Green Knight emerged from the forest and turned to challenge the Duke. At that moment, all saw the Lady of the Lake stand beside the king, the true Grail in her hand. The fake was revealed for the tawdry thing it was, and Maldred's followers deserted him en masse. The Duke fled back to his castle, but the king deprived him of both title and noble status. Since that time, there has been no Duke of Mousillon. The false Grail, that was a cup borne by Maldred's consort, and it was indeed not the Grail, but it was an artifact of great power. It was lost whenever Maldred and his consort and much of the population of Mousillon died in the Red Pox of 1322. If it were to fall back into the hands of someone evil, maybe even the Black Knight currently claiming to be the rightful Duke of Mousillon, it would be a grim fate indeed. Now we're going to talk about the undead and their role in Bretonnia. Bretonnia had always been plagued by the undead. In 1513, the Abbey of Les Moissonnetons was sacked by the necromancer Heinrich Himmler and his army, and the attackers were only repelled by the efforts of Tancred, Duke of Kenels, and his knights. However, the walking dead are a constant threat. The most notable undead menace was the Red Duke. In 476, or 1454 of the imperial calendar, that creature terrorized Aquitaine before being slain by the king at the Battle of Serenfield. In 954, it rose from the grave again, killing the Duke of Aquitaine in battle. The knights were victorious, but the Red Duke was not slain, merely driven into the forest of Chalon, where he may even be there to this very day. We're moving on to a new segment, a new chapter. We're going to talk about the political system and the overall cultural system of Bretonnia. Here's a quote by Matthias von Piffeldorf, former imperial envoy to Couronne. "We have political systems like this in the Empire. We call them protection rackets." Anyway, let's begin right now. Noble politics takes place within the feudal system, an archaic political system that was found across the old world several centuries ago. Now Bretonnia is the only land where it remains. The feudal system is based upon the oaths of loyalty between individuals and has no abstract conception of the state. While Bretonnians do think of themselves as a nation on a par with the Empire, there is no legal substance to Bretonnia beyond all people who ultimately owe loyalty to the King of Bretonnia and the lands that they hold. Peasants do form the foundation of the feudal system and are required to serve and obey the nobility. They do not swear oaths, as peasants are not thought to have the honor to keep them. Instead, they are told their duties and forced to fulfill them, even if violence is needed to encourage them. At the very top of the social hierarchy is the king. The king is sovereign in his power, which means he is not bound by the law. He can make laws whenever he wants to and whatever he wants to make it about, and anything he does is legal because he does it. If the king were corrupt, Bretonnia would suffer a serious problem because of that. But then you have Lewin, who is a shining example of chivalry, and thankfully because of that, Bretonnia does thrive on. Below the king, you have the dukes. A Bretonnian duke has royal power within his dukedom, but he is still subject to the king. That means a duke acting within his own dukedom cannot break the law unless he disobeys a direct order from the king himself. Unlike royal power, the power of the dukes has been abused, most notably in Mousillon. There is no current duke of Mousillon to avoid having someone hold such authority in such a corrupt area. All dukes hold their land directly from the king. Lewin also holds the dukedom of Couronne from the king, and thus holds it from himself. Legally, he is two different people. In theory, the king can create as many dukes as he wants, but the title is meaningless without land. In practice, only the 14 great fiefs descended from Gilles and his companions are held to be worthy of that status. Then below a duke, you have a baron. Barons are nobles who hold land directly from the king but are not dukes. They are subject to royal law and royal command, but not to the laws or commands of any other noble, including the dukes. Thus, a barony is legally independent of the dukedom in which it is found. There are not many barons in Bretonnia. Note that nobles who hold land from Lewin in his capacity as Duke of Couronne are not barons. Only those who hold land from him in his capacity of King of Bretonnia have that status. A little bit confusing, and I get that, but that is part of the fun of Bretonnia. Then below the barons, you have lords. Lords are nobles who hold land from a lord other than the king. They are subject to royal law, the ducal law, the dukedom where they hold land, and the laws of their immediate lord. Even the vassals of barons are subject to ducal law. The baronial immunity is not passed down. The lords form the overwhelming majority of the landed nobility of Bretonnia. Below a lord, you have the knight, which is at the bottom of the nobility ladder. Knights hold no land and often serve nobles in return for food and lodging. It is important to note that all nobles are also knights. It is only those knights who hold no other title who are at the bottom of the scale. Then you have titles of honor, and they carry legal rights of less importance than those attaching to the titles of power. This would be the Earl. Earls are rich and powerful nobles. That title grants no extra powers, but is a sign of recognition by the king. Many earls are also barons, but not all. Then you have a marquis. A marquis is a noble responsible for a fief in an area subject to attack, often on the borders of the kingdom. A marquis is allowed to gather forces and build fortifications without seeking permission from his superiors. Then you have a castellan. A castellan is a noble with responsibility for a major castle, which is usually held by his feudal superior. He has full authority over the castle and its lands unless his lord is present. I think it's pretty important to talk about the laws of Bretonnia because they do define the social identity of Bretonnia as well. If you want to know how ridiculous it is, it's because of their many laws and how the peasantry are pretty much abused. There's a period in Warhammer history where they were taking a more comical route with their lore, and it would later be mixed in with more serious lore too. But let's go ahead and get into it right now. The laws of chivalry is what we'll begin with. The nobles of Bretonnia are, for the most part, subject to the laws of chivalry, also known as royal laws, because they are declared by the authority of the king. Peasants are not subject to these laws, and there are some activities forbidden to nobles that are permitted to peasants. In most cases, an action is only an offense under the law of chivalry if the victim is a noble or foreigner. Peasants are a completely different matter. A noble has a legal duty to protect, guide, and judge the peasants under his rule, but quite a lot is permitted under the guise of instilling proper respect for the nobility, and very few nobles bother to investigate reports of abuses. A noble who acts against another lord's peasants is committing a crime, not against the peasantry, but the noble himself. The royal law forbids all standard crimes such as theft, assault, and murder. Violence within the context of a legitimate grievance is permitted. However, the laws also forbid actions unbecoming to a noble, such as engaging in a trade. The courts of chivalry are elaborate events closely defined by law. A court must be convened by the liege lord of the accused or by someone higher in the direct chain of fealty. The king, therefore, can convene a court to try any noble. The court must be publicly proclaimed 3 times on separate days, no more than 2 weeks before, and no later than the day before. The convening lord sits as a judge, and 7 other nobles of rank at least equal to the accused sit as a jury. The accused must appear before the court in person or provide a good excuse. The judge decides whether to admit an excuse or not. If he does, he dissolves the court and sets a date for it to reconvene. If he does not, the case proceeds without the accused. The accused makes arguments in his defense, and the accusers make their case. The judge then sleeps on the case, and the court gathers the next morning to hear the verdict. The judge decides on guilt or innocence and then passes sentencing to the jury. A jury that disagrees with a guilty verdict may impose a light sentence, but it has no authority to overturn an acquittal. Most punishments are symbolic. Nobles are never subjected to imprisonment or corporal punishment. Fines are possible, but very rare, and mostly take the form of compensation. A noble who killed 5 of another noble's servants in a drunken rage might be required to pay the cost of training replacements, for example. Common sentences include public apology, specific services to the victim, particular limits on behavior, or imposed quests of valor. In extreme cases, a court may petition the king to strip the noble in question of his fiefs or even of his nobility. Leoncoeur insists on hearing such cases again in person, though earlier kings often imposed the punishment on the say-so of the lower courts. Any noble who refuses to honor the judgment of the court becomes an outlaw. He's still a noble, but he's not protected by the law, even against his own peasants, and it is no crime to kill him. As he remains a noble, his children and descendants remain nobles. There are few noble families without an outlaw somewhere in their family tree. Noble women are also subject to the courts of chivalry and may be assigned the same penalties as men. A quest of valor assigned to a woman is a death sentence. A few noble women have become outlaws as a result. Noble women caught pretending to be men are generally assigned a quest of valor. As these women have weapons and training, they occasionally succeed but face repeated court cases until they start behaving like proper women. Oh dear. Let's go on over to peasant law. And again, these are defining of what Bretonnia is like, which is why I think they're very important to share. It lets you know how insane things are in feudal Bretonnia. Peasant laws fall into two categories. First, there are formal laws enacted by the nobility. These require peasants to obey the nobility, hand over large amounts of taxes, and refrain from behavior that might damage the interests of the nobility. Theft from other peasants is not really illegal all the time, nor is a certain amount of brawling. Formal courts for peasants are very simple. The peasant is brought before his lord, who hears the circumstance of the case. He may allow the peasant to speak in his defense, or he may not. He then pronounces judgment and sentence. Now, they're usually corporal punishments of some sort: exposure in the stocks, flogging, torture, mutilation, the loss of a body part such as an ear, eye, hand, or leg, or death. Imprisonment costs a lord money and thus is avoided. While most peasants have no money to pay fines, lords may impose any penalty they choose for any crime. A lord might decide on a light flogging for murdering another peasant, while imposing torture and death by starvation in a gibber for being insufficiently polite to a noble. Obviously, formal justice for peasants is entirely dependent on the goodwill of the lord. In those fiefs where the lord is both wise and well-intentioned, the system works well. In others, it is a mere instrument of oppression. Because of these issues, many peasants try to deal with crimes without involving their lord. The wealthy merchants in particular want to keep the nobility out of their dealings as far as possible. The merchants have convinced many nobles that any lord looking into mercantile dealings in any detail is clearly planning to become a merchant himself, and thus in breach of the laws of chivalry. That propaganda, backed up by gifts that make the nobles happy with the current situation, has kept most nobles out of the mercantile law. Now that we've gone over a little bit of their cultures and laws, we're going to go on to the religion and custom of Bretonnia, which means we'll be talking about the Lady of the Lake. Much like the cult of Sigmar over in the Empire, here in Bretonnia you have the cult of the Lady, which is largely restricted to the worship by nobility. The Lady of the Lake, or the goddess of Bretonnia, who is completely revered throughout Bretonnia but barely known beyond. The Lady of the Lake is a truly regional goddess. She stands for purity, nobility, and courage in the face of danger. She is the ideal lady, everything a knight should love and strive to serve. In the minds of many knights, the Lady is Bretonnia in a mystical sense. Unlike virtually all other gods of the old world, the Lady is encountered by her mortal worshippers in this world. All Grail knights met her at the climax of their quest, and the Grail damsels are also said to be initiated by the Lady herself, though they speak very little of it. As a result, when the Lady is portrayed, she is portrayed consistently, a young woman of great and mystical beauty. In the cult of the Lady, she is served only by the Grail Knights and the Grail Maidens, and that is really it. There are no initiates or priests or anything like that. There's only these two here that do worship her. The women are taken from their families as children raised by the Fae Enchantress to serve the Lady with mysterious powers. At the age of 3, if they show any magical talent, that is when they are plucked away. And that has really left a profound scar in the psyche of Bretonnia. If you had a child that you loved dearly, but she showed any capability with the magic arts, she will be taken away. Any temple dedicated to the Lady is called a Grail Chapel, and are only built on sites where the Lady herself has appeared to one of her worshippers. That is most often the site where a questing knight was allowed to drink from the Grail, becoming a Grail Knight. Grail chapels are almost invariably built by the nobility. Most are made of stone and built in a soaring style dominated by pointed arches and large windows. Each chapel is a single hall with a high ceiling, a door at one end, windows on the side, and a large window in the end opposite to the door. Stained glass depicting the Lady, her servants, and great deeds of chivalry is a dominant form of decoration. Every Grail chapel faced the forest of Lauren. It's believed here is where you have the Fae Enchantress and the Grail damsels who are trained, which means that a majority of Bretonnian Grail chapels face the southeast, which is where the forests of Lauren are at. Every single Grail chapel is meant to be attended by a Grail Knight who guards it, maintains it, and goes over the values of the Lady here. Many Grail Knights would found Grail chapels on the site where they themselves encountered the Lady, and because of that, there are many more Grail chapels than Grail Knights. In addition, most Grail Knights spend their lives wandering the land, fighting evil, or serving their lords. Only a few, the Hermit Knights, choose to spend their lives watching over a Grail chapel. If you do remember, I did remark that the cult of the Lady is mostly restricted to the worship of the nobility. Instead, the peasantry follows old gods that other countries might follow as well. For the bowmen and the men-at-arms summoned to the armies of the lords, they usually follow Myrmidia. Then you have Bretonnian sailors who follow the god Manon, just as he is anywhere else in the old world, whilst Verena appeals to the few scholars of Bretonnian society, and many village elders also like to be seen to honor her. Verena is also the patron of a few merry men, those who are particularly interested in fighting for justice, and Sigmar, of course, is not worshipped here. The recurrent problems with restless dead have made the worship of Mor quite important. The Gardens of Moor are normally fortified with a wall that is able to defend against attacks from within the garden, as well as from without. They do worship a few other old world gods, but the most important one by far is Shalia. The life of a Bretonnian peasant is extremely hard, and the relief brought by Shalians is very welcome. No village is more than a day's walk from a substantial temple of Shalia, and Shalian priests are very important, just as the damsels of the lady are as well. No peasant family would choose to live more than a few minutes walk from a Shalian shrine, and one sits at the center of most villages. The nobility have recently taken to endowing small shrines of Shalia near Grail chapels, a custom that is rapidly growing in popularity. The old world's main temple of Shalia is in Coron, but because of the cult of the lady, it has no political influence, which is just fine for a lot of the followers of Shalia. Before we go on to talk about the actual knighthood and other tenets of that type of order, we're going to go through a tour of Bretonnia. We're going to go through each individual duchy and have a few facts dispensed about it. That way we know what we're looking at whenever we're playing the game and what their culture is like or whatever else that I might even touch upon. We'll get into a little bit about each duchy, but I'm not going to go into too much detail because I don't really find it consequential, but I will give you a brief overview of who they're led by and maybe even their capital too. First, we'll begin with Langui. Langui is led by Duke Talbert. Duke Talbert was a sailor in his youth, but has neither set foot on a ship nor lived within sight of the sea for over 15 years. Ever since returning from his last voyage, he has not spoken of his reasons to anyone. Since his return, Duke Talbert based himself at Grasgar Castle on the edge of the Forest of Arden. The Dukes have used this castle as a hunting lodge for generations, but Duke Talbert has been expanding it and using it as a base of operations for expeditions deep into the forest. He says his aim is to defeat the Beastmen, but many think he just wants to be as far from the sea as possible. Then you have Langui. The city of Langui is one of the wonders of the old world. It was built by the elves as a great trading port, and much of the original structure has survived the millennia. Most spectacular is a lighthouse over 300 feet tall, with walls so smooth that at first glance look like a single piece of stone. The walls of the city extend from the lighthouse, rise 60 feet above the streets, and are broad enough to ride 10 abreast along the top. Elves on their first visit invariably climb to the top of the lighthouse, and none of the lighthouse keepers would dare stop them. The buildings within the walls, however, are all human-made and are much more recent. The oldest is a castle built on an island in the middle of the harbor and commanding the whole channel with its siege engines. It is somewhat run down now, as the Duke has not visited in years. Now we're going to talk about Duke Armand of Aquitaine. Duke Armand was the younger brother of the last Duke of Aquitaine and never expected to inherit. As a knight-errant, he was famed for both his recklessness and his luck, and he refused all offers of a fief until King Lewin himself offered a place in the royal household. Again, Armand distinguished himself with feats of valor, most notably slaying the Bestegor Darmal the Crooked in single combat. Many expected him to be given a barony and probably appointed marquis. Instead, after only 2 years, he set off to seek the Grail. He quested in disguise and has not spoken of his activities since his return. A few minstrels are trying to piece his movements together, but he is not the only questing knight to hide his identity. On his return as a Grail Knight, he was made the standard bearer of Bretonnia. The position suited him perfectly. 3 years ago, the Duke of Aquitaine died, and by royal command, Armand was declared heir to the position. He is still finding his feet as an administrator. He has a strong desire to solve problems personally and martially too. Aquitaine has a castle in the southeast of a dukedom near the border with Canals. It is famous for the Lace Tower, a tall spire built with so many windows that it looks as though it is made from stone lace. Dwarfs who see it comment rather often about how it's unsafe and there will be future consequences for it. But the tower stood over a century, and no one has been allowed to enter it for over 50 years, and leaning on it is punished with 10 lashes even if you are the Duke's daughter, much to her dismayed astonishment. The town of Aquitaine is to the west of the castle and fairly small. It used to be entirely to the east, but over the years it drifted, and now the eastern side is entirely abandoned. The Duke sponsors expeditions to clear out unsavory inhabitants and encourages burghers to settle there, but it isn't working. Now we're going to talk about Duke Chilfroy of Artois. Duke Chilfroy is a huge man, stronger and tougher than any of his knights or nobles. He is also famously grim. He has never been heard to laugh and repeatedly only smiles when surveying the devastation he has wrought on his enemies. And while he is not a subtle man, he is a great war leader when strategies are simple and his followers need only be inspired. The Duke spends most of his time hunting beasts, beastmen, and other monsters in the depths of the Forest of Arden. The Great Hall of Castle Artois is decorated with the preserved heads and pelts of his greatest victories. He holds a ducal law court there and is notorious for dealing with cases quickly by declaring the higher ranked party to be in the right, handing down brutal punishments to the loser. As a result, people do everything they can to avoid taking a case before the Duke, which is the way Chilfroy likes it. Then you have Castle Artois. The seat of the Dukes of Artois is located within the Forest of Arden. As a result, it is only the ducal seat with no town outside the walls. The castle itself, however, has a substantial keep and a very large courtyard surrounded by a stone curtain wall. There's a ditch beyond the wall, but it is filled with sharpened stakes rather than with water. Duke Chilfroy is always based here, but he spends about half his time riding out to hunt beastmen. The courtyard contains accommodation for many warriors. The Duke found the ability to retreat swiftly after a good battle is vital in the forest, accounting for the high number of mounted yeomen here. The large number of horses means that the castle needs even more supplies than normal. The stream of wagons is almost constant. The Duke disdains using mercenaries in battle, but he does hire expendable outsiders as scouts. Any characters with a reputation as opponents of chaos can find work simply by turning up at the castle and asking. Now we get to talk about one of my favorite dukes of Bretonnia, Duke Bohemond of Baston. Duke Bohemond of Baston is a Grail Knight, particularly renowned for fighting monsters to the point that he is known as Beast Slayer. He is also famous for refusing to fight inferior opponents, even if they attack him. He merely stuns them so that he can turn his attention elsewhere. As his prowess has grown, the search for worthy foes has taken him to many places within Bretonnia and beyond. He was one of the few dukes to ride personally to the aid of the Empire against the storm of chaos. While Bohemond is a lineal descendant of Gilles le Breton, he is absolutely loyal to King Louis and has no desire for the crown. Indeed, he delegates the whole business of administering his dukedom to his steward and justice to his justiciar. Alas, he is not a very good judge of character and finds himself replacing these men with distressing frequency. Then you have Castle Baston. Castle Baston is located almost exactly in the center of the dukedom. The whole of it and the surrounding town are filled with antiquities made sacred by the association with Gilles le Breton, or Gilles the Unifier. Old building statues and bones, including the head of Smergus, stand testimony to Gilles' prowess, as well as a few ancient stone structures remain, as well as a number of sections of the former castle are carefully preserved. It's a location that is very popular for tourism, or just Grail Knights who are going there to the Grail Chapel of Gilles le Breton. And so there's a lot of money that goes into it because of that. You have the humble chapel, which has stood for over 1,000 years, by far the oldest Grail chapel established and maintained by peasants. It is found a couple of days west of Castle Baston, just outside of a village that caters almost entirely to visiting pilgrims. Then we have Duke Alberic of Bordelot. Duke Alberic is renowned for his personal courage and astounding self-discipline. He is also notorious for expecting all of his household knights to reach the same standard and for dismissing those who do not. As a result, he has the smallest household of any of the dukes, but the knights there are some of the greatest in the realm. The Duke has always wanted to go on the quest for the Grail, but his father died when he was young, and he never felt like he was able to hand the responsibilities of his dukedom to someone else. His eldest son, Frermund, would be a fine candidate, but he left on his own Grail quest. That and the Duke's advancing age seem to have pushed him to do more than wish. Solid rumor suggests that he is looking for a reliable steward to run the dukedom in his absence. The city of Bordelot is an ancient foundation and a bustling port. Castle Bordelot, seat of the Duke, looks out over the whole city from a cliff rising over the harbor. The siege engines on the wall can reach any point in the bay or the city itself. It is said engineers are good enough to sink a moored rowboat without affecting the boats to either side. The first chapel housed within Castle Bordelot is the most sacred Grail chapel in Bretonnia. The Dukes willingly play a large share of its upkeep because it brings them a lot of status, and most of the Dukes of Bordelot have been Grail Knights. However, the most important temple is that of Manon, which is not exactly in the city. Rather, it is housed in an enormous ship permanently moored near the entrance to the harbor. It is exposed to storms, but the priests say that Manon protects it, and it has survived for many years. Now we're going to talk about Duke Theodric of Brionne. Duke Theodric almost seems to be two different people. In battle, he's a terror, wielding his great battle axe to deadly effect. He's faced down terrifying enemies, leaving their corpses on the ground. He always leads from the front, and rarely returns unwounded. Among his knights, it is whispered that some war spirit comes upon him, for he seems to take great delight in slaughter. Away from battle, the Duke is a patron and connoisseur of music and song. He is the greatest patron of minstrels in the whole of Bretonnia, and listens to their stories of love with great attention. He's something of a minstrel himself, and his compositions are competent enough. Indeed, almost all artists can stand to praise them to disguise without feeling they are utterly sacrificing their integrity. The Duke is also rumored to be a very enthusiastic lover. It is said that the noblewomen of Brionne hope that the rumor is true, and that the noblemen fear that it is. Now we have Duke Hubald of Carcassonne. Duke Hubald is a relatively small man, wiry and fast rather than powerful. He speaks only when absolutely necessary, and even then, he uses as few words as possible. No one who knows him has ever seen him smile, much less heard him laugh. His wife, Schmilde, was a political match, and the fact that the couple have 4 children, all of whom take after the Duke, is a matter of some wonderment. The Duke is, however, respected by all of his men. He is the finest war leader that the Carcassonnians have had in generations, and a brave warrior in person. Unlike many Bretonnian knights, he's willing to use ambushes and feints to defeat monstrous opponents. He argues that the orcs that pour out of the mountains to burn villages do not deserve to be fought with honor. and he lives over in Castle Carcassonne, which stands on an island surrounded by the river Songaise, the westernmost of the tributaries of the river Brienne that lies wholly within the dukedom. The attached town is small and exists to provide services to the large number of shepherd companies who come to the castle and take jobs with the duke. As a result, it is a very rough place. The castle itself is designed to be defensible, but acts primarily as a base camp. The Duke would not fall back here to prepare for a siege. Rather, he would harry invading armies while slowly falling back to the Brienne. There is only a single curtained wall, which encloses a large mustering area, and the keep is very small. The Duke lives in a complex of buildings that are less defensible, but much more comfortable. Now we could talk about the King of Bretonnia and the Duke of Couronne. The current King of Bretonnia, Louis Leoncoeur, is also the Duke of Couronne. He's a Grille Knight, as is required of all kings of Bretonnia, and many are saying he's the greatest king the land has had in centuries. Flatterers even say the greatest since Gilles le Breton himself. King Louis often goes to the field of battle with his troops, and when he does so, he rides a hippogriff, striking fear into his enemies. His prowess in battle is such that even those who meet him dismounted are prone to running away, and the king's presence on the battlefield seems to grant Bretonnians greater courage. Away from war, he is renowned as a just monarch. He will not allow the letter of the law to cloak abuses of its spirit, and even the lowliest noble can seek a personal audience. The king has issued a decree that none are to suffer for what they say during such an audience, and he enforces it. Whenever the king gets involved, justice is done. The only regret most Bretonnians have is that their king is still only one man. Then we can talk about Couronne. Next to the smooth field is the Lion Ring, the largest and finest horse racing stadium in the old world. It is a large oval built entirely in stone with ranked tiers of seating. There has been a stadium here since before the unification of Bretonnia, and some say the foundations are elven. Some say the whole structure is elven, but they're definitely wrong. Until very recently, it was clearly a more spectacular structure than Castle Couronne, and recent building work has only managed to make it debatable. The other main feature of Couronne is the Temple of Shalia. This is the premier temple of Shalia in the old world, seat of the matriarch and goal of the pilgrimages from every nation. However, it has very little influence on local politics, as the Lady of the Lake is far more important to the nobility of Bretonnia. The supreme leaders of most religions would find this irksome, but it seems to suit the matriarch of Shalia perfectly. Then you have Duke Hagen of Gisero. Duke Hagen is a Grille Knight and a close companion of King Louis. The Duke is utterly committed to the ideals of knighthood, even more so than most Grille Knights, and the king knows that he can rely on him for advice on the chivalric thing to do. Duke Hagen's decisions are unclouded by concern for consequences, so the king does not always take his advice. King Louis is mindful that it sometimes is better to act unchivalrously and avoid throwing away hundreds of lives. The Duke sometimes has trouble with these decisions. He is aware that the king is has more responsibilities in general, and still trusts his friend's commitment to the ideals of chivalry. Still, every time King Louis compromises those principles for the greater good, the Duke worries about the possibility of corruption. Duke Hagen hardly ever leaves the king's side. The king likes to have the Duke's advice readily available, and the Duke, though he would scarcely admit it to himself, wants to keep an eye on the king. Then you have a few locations about Gisero, but we'll talk about the primary town, or city. The city of Gisero is a busy place full of traders and travelers stopping on their way along the Grismere. There are more imperial merchants in Gisero than in any other city in Bretonnia, and it may be the only place in the world where people do not immediately think of sailors when they think of Marienburg. A number of land traders come from the wasteland through the Gisero Gap. The city has fine merchant houses pressed right up against decaying slums, many of which used to be fine merchant houses. For some reason, merchant families in Gisero rarely maintain their property for more than one generation. The city is dominated by Castle Gisero, an enormous sprawling complex that runs along a ridge in the east of the city. There is only a single curtained wall, but it is over a mile long and encloses two large keeps as well as many other buildings. Since the Duke began spending most of his time in Couronne, most of Castle Gisero has been closed down. Now we can talk about Lyonesse. Duke Adelhard of Lyonesse appears to be a simple man. He excels on the battlefield and whilst off it enjoys feasting, gambling, and other entertainments of warriors. Some observers of his style have suggested that his true loyalty is to Ulrich, not the Lady of the Lake, and blame it on the Norscan blood found in northern Lyonesse. The Duke keeps himself aloof from the politics of his dukedom as far as possible. If a conflict spreads to the point that he can't ignore it, he typically takes his forces in, crushes all parties, takes their lands, and declares a resolution. This has been effective every time he has done it, so that the nobility now try to keep their scheming from drawing the attention of their lord. Pretty effective way to do that for sure. Then you have the Castle of Lyonesse. It is set on an island off the northwest coast of Lyonesse. The walls of the castle, built centuries ago, are washed by the sea at high tide. The small boats can sail right into the outer courtyard. The inner courtyard is higher up and always completely dry, whilst the great keep stands on the very peak of the island, commanding a fine view of the bay. Duke Adelhard's feats can be heard across the whole island. Then you have Duke Volkard of Montfort. Duke Volkard is something of an anomaly among the dukes of Bretonnia. He is a fearsome warrior, but he hardly ever fights on horseback. The mountains that cover his dukedom severely limit mounted combatants, and the Duke accepts no limits in his pursuit of the greenskin that infests his lands. Duke Volkarn is possibly the Bretonnian Duke most loved by his people. He genuinely seems to care about peasant villages and tries to relieve them when they are attacked by goblinoids. He has set up a network of signal beacons across the mountains, which means relief forces arrive more often than not, and the Duke goes in person if he can. Once he has relieved a village, he establishes an impromptu court to hear any complaints of unjust treatment and sets things to rights. The Duke is a tall man with dark hair cropped very close. Many Montfortian peasant girls dream about their Duke, as do most of the noble women. Then we have Montfort. The castle and town of Montfort sit at the Bretonnian end of Axbite Pass, an important line of defense against possible invasion by greenskins or the Empire. The castle is the most impressive human-built fortification in the old world. The main body of the castle is on the north side of the pass, with walls rising over 60 feet from the rock in 5 tiers, each independently defensible. The lower 3 tiers stop against the rock of a cliff face, but the top 2 tiers in the keep are on a smaller peak, and thus run all the way around. There is a well within the keep, which stories say is over 1,000 feet deep. The water is certainly a long way down. Double walls run from the lowest tier of the castle, closing the whole pass. They are anchored by a small castle at the far end and a large gatehouse in the center. This is the only way to enter or leave the pass, and a place where tolls are charged. As a result, the town of Montfort is split in two. The town within the pass buys iron from mining caravans and forges it into useful goods before shipping them on, as the tolls are then a lower portion of the price. The town outside the pass provides services to merchants and is generally a more pleasant place to stay. The craftsmen of Inner Montfort are the finest in Bretonnia, and their weapons and armor are highly respected. The inns of Outer Montfort are renowned for providing absolutely any sort of lodging you could desire, as long as you can find the right one. There is very little contact between the two towns, as even residents must pay to pass through the gate. It is said that a resident of Inner Montfort is more likely to visit Altdorf than Outer Montfort. That may actually be true. Then you have Mousillon, where there is no duke. If you remember, Duke Maldred was deprived of his title after the affair of the False Grail, and no one has been appointed to his position from that point on. But there is a few rumors and stories about a mysterious knight raising an army in Mousillon and claiming to be the Duke. The king has not responded yet, but it is only a matter of time until he does so. The city of Mousillon stands near the mouth of the river Grismiri, surrounded by swamps. It seems to be slowly crumbling back into the swamp, a lot like my state of Louisiana. Anyway, but somehow it still survives. Few parts are actually maintained, the walls being one of the main exceptions. The repairs are not pretty, but they are effective. The residents of the city want to keep the inhabitants of the swamps out in the swamps. The economy of the city is something of a mystery. There are taverns, brothels, drug dens, fighting pits, and places where even darker vices are indulged. There are shops selling forbidden books, the accoutrements of forbidden cults, and poisons and assassin tools of every variety. There seems to be no basic food shops or tailors or any of the normal shops that you might have in a city. Most of the people who live there seem to have some business outside the walls, and wagons and boats laden with basic necessities arrive every day. Most observers think that the Mousillons barter among themselves for the basics. Now we can talk about Paravon and Duke Cassian of Paravon, who is the youngest of the Dukes of Bretonnia, still in his early 20s. He's a Grell Knight and rides a Royal Pegasus. His father died while he was on his Grell quest, and the young Duke knew nothing of his status until he came back home. He's a very likable young fellow, very optimistic and very friendly, and that is why people find it difficult to dislike him. But he tries to handle every issue by flying in the sky and trying to kill creatures to help out the kingdom, but he doesn't really pay much mind to the administration of his dukedom, much to the chagrin of his counselors. Paravon is a unique location built right by the mountains, and much like in a dwarf location, a lot of the people of Paravon have built their homes from the walls of the mountain. It's also the only city in Bretonnia with a substantial population of dwarfs. Most of them were originally imperial expatriates, but some came directly from the dwarf holds of the Vault and World's Edge mountains. There are now some dwarf families who have lived there for generations. Now for the final one, Gainels. Let's go ahead and talk about the Duke of Gainels, and that would be Duke Tancred II of Gainels. Duke Tancred II has been a fine lord of Gainels. His finest moment was the defeat of the necromancer Heinrich Himmler and a chaos champion Krell, who allied with the Skaven and attacked the Abbey of La Maussantal, and that was in 1513 or 2491 of the imperial calendar. And the Duke is now an old man, somewhat stooped and shrunken, but still showing his old vigor. The Duke himself, however, now feels his mortality strongly and worries about the future of his dukedom. Duke Tancred has 4 sons, or had. The eldest died fighting a wight who had raised an army of undead within Gainels itself. The second died as a knight errant in the battle against Heinrich Himmler. The third was a bit of a party boy and drowned in a cask of wine. The fourth went on a Grell quest and has not been heard from for over 10 years, and that's a very long time. He does fear that every son of his might be dead. The Duke of Canales is the only duke to use a lesser title with any frequency. He is also the Earl of Gelu, and out of respect for the knights of that region, he issues charters and decisions affecting that region over that title, as the Earl. Then you have the city of Canales, which sits right on the border of the Forest of Lauren. Indeed, the walls do not guard the eastern edge of the city, instead they run up to the trees and stop. A broad stone road runs along the border of the forest. This used to be the eastern wall, but it was cast down over 1,000 years ago at the command of the Fae. Pilgrims come from all over Bretonnia, hoping to catch a sight of the Fae in the forest. They'll stand there and look right in. As a result of the flux of pilgrims that come there, the eastern end of the city is an entertainment district with many inns, taverns, and houses of ill repute. Castle Canales stands to the north, a surprisingly modest structure given the power of the dukedom. Rumor has it that the Fae have forbidden any major expansion. Just to the west of the eastern borders stands a Grail chapel unique in Bretonnia called the Chapel of the Enchantress. Its windows depict the Fae Enchantress rather than the Lady of the Lake. There are always at least 2 Grail Knights to keep into place, though few do the job for more than a year. We're now going to talk about the Code of Chivalry, which I've alluded to throughout the various stories involving Gilles de Breton and his own son. The 7 commandments are the Bretonnian codes of chivalry that is required of every knight. If they do not follow them, well, that's a grave crime. These commandments are an integral part of Bretonnian society and government, and is often used to dictate the actions of a Bretonnian noble. We have 7 here. We'll begin right now. To serve the Lady of the Lake, to defend the domains entrusted to him, to protect the weak and fight for the right, always to fight the enemies of virtue and order, never to give up the fight until the foe be defeated, never to break faith with a friend or ally, always to display honor and courtesy. And then apart from that, you have the rules of honor, which these are certain traditional rules that are adhered to and respected by all knights, and we'll begin with that right now. A knight may only fight hand to hand with sword or lance. He may not use a missile weapon. A knight shall always accept a challenge towards personal combat. A knight shall not draw sword against his fellow Bretonnian knight except in trial by combat or within a tournament. A knight shall not allow himself to be captured alive. A knight shall not flee from the enemy, nor retreat without proper tactical cause. We're now going to talk about the Bretonnian military. One important aspect that defines Bretonnian military is that unlike the professional armies of the Empire, Bretonnia has no standing military. Instead, the kingdom relies on the long and complicated feudal service of her knights. When a lord must go to war against the enemy, he appeals to the military assistance of his vassals. They in turn take the long process of summoning their own vassals to his banner, with most knights taking with them local peasants drilled in basic ranked pike combat or archery. These armies do not follow common military training and usually have no internal hierarchy, but their tactics are simple and homogeneous enough to function smoothly in all circumstances, units being formed and reformed on the fly or at need during an extended campaign. Due to feudal law, the Bretonnian military is well known to shun advanced weaponry such as handguns, cannons, and most war machines, seeing them as all dishonorable weapons that go against the ideals of chivalry and the will of their patron, the Lady of the Lake. On the field of battle, the ultimate and most glorious goal of any Bretonnian army is to run down their foe with lance and sword, and the iron-shod hooves of their mighty knights. Such an approach to warfare has led the Bretonnians to almost always follow a strategic tactic known simply as the hammer and anvil. The peasant's role is to support the knights by peppering the foe with arrows and to crew the mighty trebuchet. Regiments of men-at-arms march into battle to protect and hold the line as the anvil. Finally, it is the knights who come charging through the field of battle, crushing their foes from the flank or rear as they essentially become the killing hammer. Protected by the Lady and her blessings, these knights storm through firestorms of lead and arrows and crush their foes and earn glory, honor, and most of all, to uphold the values of chivalry. Now we're going to talk about each individual unit where we can. The men-at-arms are the basic frontline infantry that comprises most Bretonnian armies. These men have been chosen from a very young age to be trained and equipped with basic weaponry and gear, and fight on the behalf of their lord. Wearing mostly chainmail armor, these reluctant but adequate soldiers are responsible for defending a noble master's castle, or holding the line against the enemy with a shield and spear, whilst the knights upon their mighty war horses attack from the flanks and bring victory. Peasant bowmen are commoners that are not fit to join the men-at-arms companies that are often press-ganged at need into military service as basic support units. As such, archers are a common and readily formed unit within most Bretonnian military armies, as all peasants and commoners within Bretonnia are required to maintain a proficiency with the bow, their willingness being reinforced by the promised bounty of a single copper coin for any who survive the campaign, an exception from tithing, and the right to loot the enemy fallen, which is to any peasant a potential princely fortune. Unfortunately, as with most Bretonnian infantry units, these men aren't very reliable soldiers. Ground pilgrims, though not considered an official part of Bretonnian armies, these quote-unquote pilgrims are either feral peasants or fanatic and pious followers of the Grail brotherhoods, all whom believe zealously and the holiness of their chosen Grail Knight. They will flock in their dozens to join and bask in their master's reflected glory. Equipped with the discarded weapons and armor of the Grail Knight, and whatever handmade items that they can craft for themselves, these units provide a Bretonnian army with a much more reliable source of stalwart, near unbreakable shock troop infantry, and sacrificial arrow fodder too. Now we can move on to the mainstay of the Bretonnian army, Bretonnian cavalry. Yeomen. These experienced soldiers provide the Bretonnian army with dedicated skirmishers or fast light cavalry and scouts. These veterans have fought and survived many battles with only the skills of their arms and their unwavering bravery. Such is their combat experience that yeomen are almost as skilled in combat as any knight of the realm. But such a boast is often ignored and even suppressed by the nobility. When promoted to the rank of a yeoman, these men are often divided between mounted scout yeomanry or become sergeants within a men-at-arms company. The Knight Errant. These young nobles are the lowest ranking members of most Bretonnian cavalry squadrons, as well as within the hierarchy of Bretonnian nobility. In the prime of youth, these ill-experienced but highly enthusiastic warriors comprise a significant portion of many armies on the field of battle. Fighting on horseback, these knights often engage the best enemy regiments in their eagerness to earn the title of a Knight of the Realm. Knight of the Realm. These knights are the backbone of nearly all Bretonnian armies, and as such, they are the most common members of the ruling elite. They have distinguished themselves in errantry and have thus received a fief or a position of power within noble society. They are expected to honor and defend their lords and kingdom from the depredation of all those that would seek to destroy it, fighting on horseback with lance in hand and their unwavering faith in Our Lady of the Lake. A questing knight. These knights are those nobles who are seeking the attention of their patron goddess, the Lady of the Lake, in hopes of acquiring her blessing as a means to obtain the status of a Grail Knight. Living a solitary existence, these men would strive to prove himself to the lady, performing good deeds, slaying foul beasts, and aiding the armies of Bretonnia when in times of peril. Then the Grail Knight. These knights are the very pinnacle of Bretonnian chivalry, honor, and bravery. Those questing knights who have drunk from the Holy Grail are blessed with the powers of the lady, and have thus been proven worthy to become a Grail Knight. To obtain the position of a Grail Knight is the ultimate goal for all knights, and to become one is the very embodiment of a holy warrior. It is said that these knights are one of the greatest of mankind's warriors to ever walk the earth. A Pegasus Knight. Unlike traditional mounted warfare, those knights that can tame and ride the mighty Pegasus into battle are warriors without equal. Flying across the battlefield with wings of angelic appearance, the Pegasus Knights take to the sky and fight the flying monstrosities the enemy has unleashed upon them with their lance and sword. Now we have the Bretonnian artillery, which is only a trebuchet. These are immense siege engines used to lob large projectiles at enemy formations from a safe distance. The machine itself can vary greatly in design, and the projectiles thrown can range in weight from a cannonball-sized rock up to something as large as a peasant's hovel. Due to its reputation as a dishonorable weapon and the lack of any proper education amongst the common people, only a handful of craftsmen have the skills and knowledge to build such expensive and time-consuming devices. Thus, with only a finite number of engineers available for hire, and no consistent quality or qualifications amongst them, trebuchets are usually scratched and built on-site using whatever materials lay at hand, and then are stripped down again for scrap, and with only the valuable iron forged parts traveling from siege to siege along with the hired engineer that forged them. Now for the Bretonnian Lords. You have a Bretonnian Lord. These are powerful noblemen or knights whose deeds are recounted throughout the lands, warriors unparalleled in combat and a stout follower of the codes of chivalry. These Bretonnian Lords include the mighty earls, barons, and dukes that occupy much of the higher nobility. Proud and powerful warriors all, Bretonnian Lords are excellent warrior generals. Then, the Prophetess of the Lady. The most favored devotees of the Lady are those who have served their divine mistress faithfully for much of their lives. They are highly potent spellcasters, and their magic can dramatically impact the outcome of any battle. Their magic is elemental in nature, controlling air and water, plants and animals, calling down raging storms, thick cloaking mists, and mighty bolts of lightning in the middle of a fight. Then we have Bretonnian heroes, like a Grail Damsel. Lesser servants of the Lady, not as long in service as a prophetess, they specialize in protective wardings, purifications, healing, and the dispelling of hostile magic, coming to the aid of armies and questing knights at need, moving always from place to place at the Lady's will so as to root out evil and corruption, whilst hunting down potentially gifted children and guiding heroes to holy sites in need of protection. Then you have the Paladin. Paladins are powerful warriors renowned throughout Bretonnia for their chivalry and feats of arms and combat against all evil. They are as respected and noble as a knight can become without the Grail blessing. Many of them are highly ranked nobles holding titles such as Earl or Baron, while others hold warrior titles such as Knight Marshal or Knight Warden. They are legendary heroic fighters as well as natural leaders for any army. Then you have the Green Knight. Legend states that this may be Gilles Le Breton himself, eternally serving his lady and awaiting the time he may be needed to defend the kingdom again. He appears only in times of the greatest need, so to aid the king in battle or a fellow Grail Knight. His primary duty seems to be offering the final test of worthiness onto a questing knight. He will appear and challenge a knight when a lady deems him ready. If the knight then defeats him in single combat or simply passes a test of either courage or chivalry, the lady will then manifest and grant her new hero a blessing from the Holy Grail itself. And finally, the Fey Enchantress. This individual is a living voice of the Lady of the Lake, the mightiest sorceress within the kingdom. Often seen within the company of the mystical Green Knight, she travels the land aiding questing knights and giving spiritual and magical aid and advice to the king and varied dukes. Her primary duty is to select and proclaim the next rightful king of Bretonnia. From amongst the Brotherhood of Order of Grail Knights, it is uncertain whether she is an immortal or is simply replaced by the next most powerful prophetess when her time is done. Grail pilgrims are fanatics who are dedicated to a Grail Knight. They'll pick up anything that a Grail Knight will throw aside. They will wear their armor, they will carry them along if they're wounded. There's been a time where it could be said that some Grail Knights might have been killed by being crushed by scavenging Grail pilgrims. They are fanatical. And then you have the Grail Reliquae, which is a little bit different and just as grim too. That is where they'll actually carry the body of a Grail Knight on their back or whatever they can with them into battle. They are fanatical worshippers of the knights from whom they derive their namesake, but they are very powerful. If you want a zealot-based group who's going to die in battle for you no matter what, that will be your Grail Pilgrims and naturally the Grail Reliquae. Hello, thank you for watching my lore video. If you would like to see more lore videos in the future, please do consider supporting me on Patreon. Even $1 for a month can go a long way to help me out. These videos take a lot of time in comparison to gameplay videos, and it does help to know that there's a lot of feedback to all of the work that I put in. It takes a lot more time to prepare a lore video than it does to record a single gameplay video. And again, just check it out, consider it. Don't forget to leave a like down below. Likes do help me know what all of you like, and if you think that I could be better in any fashion or way, don't forget to leave any constructive criticism too. I do read every single comment. Thank you for watching and look forward to more content in the future. Until then.